In late July, Canon released firmware updates for basically every one of their current production EOS hybrid and cinema cameras. For most of these cameras, the change list was quite short, consisting of simply a new password function that's part of, as I understand it at least, a new European Union technical directive on network-connected devices. However, for the R5 Mark II, the update contained a lot more than just that. Now, before I get into the new features, this update comes with one of the most extensive lists of bug fixes and otherwise updates that I have seen from Canon, at least in recent memory. Specifically, there are 11 noted bug fixes in this firmware, covering everything from Wi-Fi and network connectivity and transfers to the camera locking up with an error code of 70 in a whole variety of situations. Now, I'm not going to go over each of these individually, but the list scrolling by now is the complete list of these fixes from the release notes. So, with the bug fixes out of the way, let's talk about the biggest new change, the password function. Now, I try to keep my opinions out of these videos as much as I possibly can. My point here is to explain how things work so that you can make up your own mind whether or not that feature is useful to you in your situations and applications. Unfortunately, I'm struggling to maintain that level of professionalism with this function. First, this isn't a feature that's intended to protect your camera from being stolen or your images from being downloaded or removed or viewed. It's a feature that is intended, as I understand it, to comply with an EU directive that, as best as I can tell, has to do with network security and personal information protection. Now, beyond that, I don't know the details. I don't live and am not a citizen of the European Union, and quite honestly, I have better things to do with my time than dig into and read their regulations and requirements. Anyway, after installing the firmware, the camera will require you to set up a 6-digit password. It will then require that password every time the camera is powered on or wakes up from sleep, at least until you disable the function. Now, if the entered password is incorrect, the camera will prompt you for up to 10 attempts to re-enter it. After 10 failed attempts, you can power cycle the camera and try again, or wait 10 minutes and try again. Now, that said, once you've set up the initial password, you can disable the password functionality through either the new login screen that you will see every time you power the camera up, or the new password settings menu page. Once this is disabled, the camera operates just like it always has, booting directly into the shooting standby screen and live view and being ready essentially immediately. In fact, I checked and I couldn't find a measurable difference in boot times with this disabled or prior to the installation of this firmware. Now, that said, if you're one of those people that somehow thinks this sounds like a good idea or a useful feature, I suspect your position on that will change almost immediately after you realize how poorly implemented the interface for this functionality is. You, like me, have probably been trained by your smartphone to expect password entries like this to be a smooth experience. You know, something like just typing in the code and the phone or camera unlocks. Well, that's not how Canon's implementation works. Instead, they've elected to use what's quite possibly the worst implementation for a password login interface that I have ever seen. The process is so slow and cumbersome that using the function in any kind of practical situation means you're either going to run your batteries flat in no time by never allowing your camera to sleep, or you're going to miss everything you're trying to capture while you're trying to unlock the camera to capture it. Now, with that said, let's walk through the process of setting this up, since you have to do it anyway when the firmware is installed and the camera reboots. And, of course, disabling this, like any sane photographer is going to do almost immediately as well. Now, after your R5 Mark II restarts from its firmware update, you'll be presented with this screen, requiring you to create a password. You'll need to enter a 6-digit numeric password and then re-enter it to confirm it. Only then will the camera allow you into the normal live view screen. Now, once this password is set up, when the camera is turned on or wakes up, you will see this screen where you can log in. To do so, touch the text box that is the password entry area to open the password entry screen, then enter your password. Now, to enter the password here, you can of course use the touch screen like most of us will do, but you can also use the quick command dials. That's either the dial on the back of the camera or the one on the top around the mode button, or the multi-controller to move the cursor around. Now, if you're doing the cursor routine, you can then use set, either the physical button on the back of the camera or pressing straight in on the multi-controller to select the highlighted digit and add it to your function. Now, once you've entered your password, select OK to return to the previous screen, where the password will now be shown as asterisks in that text field. Now you can select OK a second time to actually unlock the camera. Now, on this login screen, you will also find a checkbox that allows you to stop the camera from asking you for a password every time it boots up. And I'm going to recommend checking this now so you aren't bothered with this stupidity again. I'd also recommend writing down the password somewhere safe. If you forget your password and the camera is locked, you can reset all of the camera settings, effectively a factory reset, from login screen. To do this, select the reset button and then confirm that you are willing to reset everything on your camera. The camera will then return to its default configuration, and you will have to go through the process of not only setting up your password again, but putting in all the rest of your camera settings. Now, in addition to the new unlock screen, you'll also find 2 new menus here as well. One for the password system and one for a log of password and other system level functions. No, if you were wondering, they're not both in the same place where it would make sense either. The new password menu is found under Manage Password on the Various Settings page, or page 4 of the yellow Setup menu section. On entering that menu, you will find 3 options: Password Reset, Change Password, and Clear Entered Information. Of course, the password in the password reset label is bizarrely abbreviated, even though there is no obvious reason why it needed to be. And in fact, spelling it out is shorter than other settings in the menu that are fully spelled out, like Bluetooth settings, and that menu entry uses the same styling and layout. In any event, the password request entry controls whether the camera will require the password to be entered on wake or power up. This does the same thing as checking the Do Not Ask Again box on login, or re-enabling that if you've disabled it, either through this menu or by that checkbox. To change this setting, you will need to enter your current password. Then you can turn the boot password prompt on and off. Next is Change Password, and this is where you go to change your actual password. As is the case with changing passwords, anytime you do this, you will be prompted for your old password, a new password, and then to re-enter the new password to complete the update. Finally, the last entry here is Clear Entered Information, and as far as I can tell, this performs a factory reset on the camera, clearing the password and all other information that has been entered into it. Though, like usual, Canon doesn't actually document all of this in the manuals, so I don't know exactly how it would behave, and to be perfectly honest, I don't really want to go through the process of resetting and reconfiguring my R5 Mark II just to find out. Now, as for the new System Log menu, you will find that on page 6 of the yellow Setup menu section under Show Log. Now, again, it's not entirely clear exactly what will end up in this camera log. Currently, it shows when changes are made to the password prompt, and network information. Canon also says nebulously that other settings may be here as well, though I haven't found anything aside from the password and network stuff in any of my camera's logs yet. Unfortunately, apparently there exists no way to clear this log without clearing the camera's settings as well. And it's also not clear to me how many entries the log will contain before old entries are purged. Now, given that these cameras have, at least compared to something like a smartphone, very little internal storage for the firmware and settings, and now this log, an unbounded system log feels like a very bad idea. Now, with the password system out of the way, let's talk about the rest of the updates that landed with this firmware, starting with the ability to do firmware updates directly when connected to a network instead of having to insert a flash card or download them, put them on a flash card, and insert that into your camera. Now, I'll be honest, my take on this is a bit mixed. I think it's a nice feature to have, but at the same time, I've also become extremely conservative about updating my camera's firmwares. Canon doesn't have anything approaching a perfect track record when it comes to doing firmware updates. In fact, this firmware itself is a perfect example of that. Firmware 1.1.0 was either never actually released or pulled almost immediately after release by Canon USA because of bugs, which is why we're talking about firmware 1.1.1 instead. Personally, I'll continue to delay my firmware updates until sometime after they're released and continue to do them from a flash card instead of over the network. But if you don't mind the potentially increased risk of bricking your camera and having to send it to Canon to have a firmware fixed, this might be for you. Also, speaking of network-related changes, there are two additional ones in this firmware. For starters, Canon has added support for the Software Development Assistance Kit. I'm not exactly sure what this is, as I can't find any information on Canon USA's developer community site about it, and the camera already supported the Camera Control API over the network, so it's not that. Second, Canon has changed the file transfer order when sending images with voice memos over FTP. Previously, the order was image first, then the voice memo WAV file. Now the voice memo WAV file is sent first, then the image. Now, for the vast majority of users, this probably shouldn't matter at all. But if you or your employer has written custom FTP software that expected those files in a certain order, that software may need to be updated before you'll be able to use this camera with FTP, or at least with that system. Now, point 3 in the changelog was the anti-flicker control system is now automatically detects flicker at 100 and 120 Hz during live view display. Previously, at least according to the manual, it was 50 and 60 Hz. Now, I'll be honest here, I'm very confused by what this change was actually supposed to address. Flickering lights, such as LEDs and compact fluorescents that run off of AC power, flicker at either 100 or 120 Hz, depending on whether the AC frequency is 50 or 60 Hz respectively. Now, based on some crude testing that I did, the anti-flicker system already worked at those frequencies. And as best as I can tell, the actual change here is simply to the documentation so that it reads 100 and 120 Hz instead of 50 and 60, not what the camera is actually doing. That said, what's not in the release notes is that there is now a new auto flicker detection setting. Unfortunately, Canon must assume that the settings function is entirely self-evident, as they don't actually explain it in the manual in any detail, only that it's available regardless of the anti-flicker detection, but beyond that, they say nothing. Does it actually correct things? Does it turn it on and off based on detected flicker? No idea. Canon also saw fit to update the pre-continuous shooting function in this firmware. Specifically, they've added a frame limit setting called number of images. This allows you to cap the maximum number of frames in the pre-continuous buffer to something other than the previous default of 15. That said, the maximum limit is still 15 frames. Now, I definitely like the addition of this, as there have been plenty of times where I've wanted to limit the pre-release burst length, especially when I'm not shooting at 30 frames per second. However, I would still like to see a larger buffer available, even if using it was only limited to lower resolution formats or smaller file formats like CRAW or JPEG. Now, in addition to the AF-related bug fixes, Canon has made a few additional updates to the AF system as well. First is a new servo AF characteristic, Case Special, indicated by an SP icon. Canon calls out this mode specifically as improving the tracking of subject behind nets, such as in badminton or volleyball. Now, that said, I haven't even remotely had the opportunity to begin to test this mode yet, and I'd like to see how it performs, especially with subjects behind, say, fences. Secondly, Canon claims to have improved the video AF tracking for difficult to focus on subjects. Unfortunately, Canon also didn't elaborate on this change any more than that either, so it's not all clear what or how this changes the actual function of the camera. Canon also made a couple of relatively minor but nice user interface improvements as well. Unfortunately, they haven't taken the time to make their menus consistent and unified and consolidate duplicate functionality, but they have assigned the ability to assign airplane mode or toggling of airplane mode to a button function. The new airplane mode toggle can be assigned to any of the programmable buttons except for the shutter release, multi-controller, and flash menu direct button if you have an external flash with one, in both movie and video mode, or still in video mode, as well as the movie record button when the camera is in movie mode. Also, for those that rate and protect images on their camera, Canon has also added the ability to automatically protect an image when it has a rating assigned. This function is enabled through the Protect When Setting the Rating setting, found at the bottom of the File Operation page, or page 1 of the blue playback menu. In addition to being able to protect images that are rated, you can also configure which rating levels you want this automatic protection to trigger with. So for example, you might only want to protect 4- and 5-star images, but not images with 1, 2, or 3-star ratings. Finally, to round out the list of new features and updated functions, Canon has improved the image stabilization performance with lenses that support peripheral coordinated control. Currently, this is limited to the RF 10 to 20mm f4L IS STM and RF 16 to 28mm f2.8 IS STM lenses, with the later of those two only being available in still mode. They have also added the ability to use exposure simulation when an external flash is attached. And finally, Canon has added 2 functions to support using the EOS R5 Mark II with the CR-A100 remote control software and CR-S700R robotic units. These updates add the ability to register focus presets and add a lower image capture frame rate to reduce overheating when the camera is used in that specific remote control unit. Now, while the changelog is long, the reality is there's not a whole lot in the firmware that's really all that exciting, at least not to me. And in some ways, the headline feature, the new password function, is a horrifically disappointing mess. Well, I'm sure it complies with the EU directive that it was implemented for. It's also been forced down the throats of every other global user. And if that wasn't bad enough, it was done so with a UI that's not smooth, clean, or effective, limiting who would actually want to have it enabled anyway to virtually nobody. Moreover, I can't help but find myself wondering, at least given how poorly Canon's firmware development process appears to function from the outside, the time involved in implementing this password function represented a significant diversion of resources away from implementing useful photographic functions. For example, I keep championing the idea of adding frame averaging, which would allow us to do neutral density or the effect of neutral density in camera with better quality than actual neutral density filters, but it's not there. Or, for that matter, work on cleaning up and restructuring the menu system to be cleaner, more coherent, easier to use and follow, and have less odd redundancies. Either way, this is what we have, and hopefully, now that Canon has done this, they will make the next firmware update more useful to us photographers. That said, I hope you found this useful, or at least interesting. If you did, let me know by hitting that like button. Also, if this kind of thing seems like it might be your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. Finally, if you'd like to help and support this channel, you can help us for free by liking this video, sharing it with your friends, and leaving a comment with your experiences. Likewise, you can support us by hitting that thanks button or buying yourself something you've always wanted from one of the affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.